Hello, welcome to the 15th of April, Tales from the House, something to hopefully brighten your day during lockdown. I've got three things for you today, and where I left you yesterday, just 20 minutes before midnight, the Titanic had struck an iceberg, but nobody was particularly bothered at that point in time. In fact, some people didn't even realize. Well, of course, we must start today with the sinking of the Titanic, and if we can briefly have a look at the sinking of the Titanic and the ship itself, I think some of this you will know, but much of it you will find genuinely fascinating, I think. The largest passenger ship built at this point in time, 269 meters long, and in 1912, when it sank today, the 15th of April, it was the largest man-made moving object on the planet. To give you some idea of the size of this ship, it was built by Holland and Wolff in Northern Ireland, in the docks there. They were commissioned by the White Star Line and Cunard, and it was sent out into the Irish Sea for its sea trials only 8 days before it was due to debut on its first journey from Southampton to New York. And it was going to go from Southampton regularly, despite the fact that it was registered in Liverpool, as you can see at the back of the Titanic here. That's merely a sort of tradition because the White Star Line and Cunard had their head offices in Liverpool. So right the way up until the 60s, I think, they registered all their ships in Liverpool, although the Titanic was due to be the first of pretty much everything from now on that was going to sail from Southampton because it was more convenient. I think the first ship that Cunard had that was not registered in Liverpool was the QE2, which you can still sail on today. And this was going to be the route. You see, Southampton meant that you could take a stop at Cherbourg, which was a developing port, and you could collect lots of European traffic who wanted to sail to New York as well. So it was a big money spinner, and that's why they moved to Southampton, despite continuing to register in Liverpool. There was also going to be a stop-off. There was a traditional stop-off in Queenstown. Why? Not because there were large amounts of passengers, although people did get on there, but because it was the last opportunity to refuel. And this was a steamship, remember, so you need a lot of coal, but also for food, supplies, whatever else that they might need. Some people did get on and some people did get off at that point, and famously, I suppose. So the idea then was to do this run that would take 3 weeks to get from Southampton to New York, or less. And there was a sister ship to the Titanic, the Olympic, and this ship was going to sail from Southampton to New York as well. And then we're going to start at either end and cross over and work back and forth. And this was going to be the White Star Line's big money spinner. And I'm sure a terrific success it would have been. You can see the advertising here, and there are lots of these posters you can see on the internet. This one at the bottom here says New York to Southampton and Boston, etc. But you had the same for Cherbourg, you had the same for Southampton, and you had the same for Queenstown, these sorts of posters here. The Olympic and the Titanic, 45,000 tons, the largest steamers in the world. Captained, the Titanic, captained by this man, Captain Edward Smith, who was very experienced, and when interviewed earlier said he couldn't imagine any condition could cause a ship to founder, not just the Titanic, generally a large passenger ship, because he said that modern building had gone beyond this. And that was not an odd view. Most people felt that this was the case. That doesn't mean the ship is unsinkable, but the general view was that you know, it would take something, you know, catastrophic to sink it, some sort of bomb or something like that. It would not sink due to any sort of natural cause, like waves or icebergs. And that was quite a common view at the time. There is a statue to Captain Smith, who famously went down at the helm of his ship, refusing to leave. And the statue of him is in Lichfield, which is near where he was born. He was born in Staffordshire. So there we are. A little bit about the Titanic then. A genuinely amazing, top-class luxury ship. Here you can see a replica inside of the first-class lounge. There were over 3,000 people on board, not all of them first class, clearly, but there was a gym, a pool, a Turkish bath, a squash court. There was even a kennel for the dogs of first-class passengers, and because there were so many people on board, there was a daily produced newspaper on board the ship. It was like its own floating little nation. There was also, if you were a first-class passenger and you got on, you were given a songbook with 352 different songs in, and musicians at various places on the ship were expected to be able to play all of them if any passenger requested a song at any particular point. So you could just pick out one of these 352 things. Oh, I haven't heard that, or I'd quite like to hear this, and ask the musicians, and they were expected, being top-class musicians, to be able to play any one of those 352. And the band, remember, famously played on through the sinking of the ship. I'm sure we've all seen Cameron's film, The Titanic. Well, about the sinking, there were, in fact, 6 warnings as the ship entered Iceberg Alley off the Canadian coast. About icebergs, but they were generally in the day not considered warnings, they were considered advisory. And we know the ship was struck on the front side, and they, couldn't avoid it. But largely, iceberg warnings were often just seen as advisory and ignored. The ship was still going at full speed, flank speed ahead, and this was not uncommon practice. In 1907, the SS Crown Prince Wilhelm, a German passenger liner, rammed an iceberg head-on, sustained some damage, but was able to complete its journey. So the idea that these ships wouldn't sink, the idea that icebergs weren't that much of a threat, is not an uncommon one. Schedule was everything, making sure that you made it there in time, because if you were not, like the old British Rail, if you're not on time, people just wouldn't use you. So schedule was everything. And I think that explains a little bit about the attitude. Our attitude today would be much more safety conscious because we know what happened. But these things hadn't happened, and that's why they took the view that they did. Well, of course, they were holed beneath the waterline. 6 compartments were slashed, and the ship could stay alive, stay afloat with 5 compartments breached. So desperately close run thing. But despite the fact it was only 1 compartment, the bulkheads didn't go all the way to the top to seal them off. So the water, as you notice in the film, filled one at a time. The ship started to tip in. I think 35,000 tons of water initially fell into the ship. It was just a massive amount. The displacement increased enormously. The ship split in 2 under the pressure, rather like this image here, and it took only 2.5 hours to sink by about 2:30 in the morning. Today, the 15th of April 1912, the Titanic was entirely underwater, and so were 2/3 of the passengers, mostly men. The iceberg was in fact spotted. It was a very dark, clear night. There was not a full moon, so you couldn't see anything. And yes, the lookouts didn't have binoculars, but that wouldn't have helped to aid any sight in the dark without the moon, frankly. The iceberg was spotted 37 seconds before it was struck, and the ship was immediately commanded to turn, hence it got struck on the front side, but it was simply too large, and one wonders if they had done what the Crown Prince Wilhelm did in 1907 and simply hit it straight on, whether they may well have survived. But who can know? There were not enough lifeboats on board. Everybody knows this. There were about 3,200, 3,400 people on board, and there were 16 lifeboats with 4 collapsibles, which were difficult to put in the water. Only 1,178 people were saved by the Carpathia that arrived 2 hours later, and most people in the water would have died within 15 minutes from cold shock. Of course, the Titanic was found in 1985. This is a graphical reproduction, but I'm sure you can find footage. It was just so vast that and dark down there, you can't get a picture from this far away. So you get the idea. They've assessed it. They've brought lots of things up from it. And that was the RMS Titanic, White Star's flagship, sunk this morning in the early hours on the 15th of April, 1912. And that was the last we saw of her. Or was it? Because the Chinese are building a life-size replica of the Titanic. Yes, of course they are, for a theme park in Sichuan, which is entirely landlocked, but they're building a part of an ocean and you're going to be able to stay on it. You won't go anywhere, but you'll be able to stay on it. They have even suggested they might even replicate the moment the iceberg struck, which seems a bit too far for me. But perhaps, you know, we'll see footage of this Titanic theme park absolutely dedicated to reproducing it at some point in the future. Who knows? Moving on then, I'd like to move on to this man here. Today in 1959, Fidel Castro, only 3 or 4 months after deposing Batista in the Cuban Revolution, visited New York City and was a hit. Really popular. Before the visit, nobody really knew what he was going to be like. You see, he hadn't yet nationalized any industries or taken over any American infrastructure, businesses that were there. He hadn't declared that he was going to be a communist in any way. And he arrives in New York City, you know, 3 or 4 months after securing the Cuban Revolution for a meeting of the United Nations. That's why he's there, and that's why he's allowed to be there. But also, there's no real hostility to him. In fact, quite the opposite. He hired a public relations firm and stayed for 11 days. And toured about the city like a rock star. And it felt like that. He ate hamburgers, wandering through Central Park. He fed peanuts to the elephants at the Bronx Zoo. He kissed babies. And he visited school children who were fascinated and put on beards and pretended to be him. This is remarkable stuff. He was like a rock star. The ladies loved him. I mean, they really did love him. He was a super hit. They really, really liked him. He even met President Nixon. Eisenhower refused to meet him and instead went to play golf, but he sent his Vice President Nixon to meet him. Nixon came away from the meeting saying, this guy's either going to be a problem for us or he's incredibly naive about things. Well, we know what the answer to that was. He did turn out to be a problem for the Americans. But his visit to New York City for 11 days, which began on the 15th of April, 1959, was an absolute stone-cold smash hit. Everybody loved him, especially the ladies. I can see why. I mean, the guy wanders around in combat fatigues. He's just had a revolution. He is a real-life action man. None of these movie stuff. Here he is. So I suppose I can see the appeal. I can't comment on his looks, but even today, beards are in. He would return in 1960, a year later, for another United Nations meeting. This was very different. By now, he had nationalized all of the American industries. Companies had lost stacks of money. He arrived and gave a 4.5-hour speech at the United Nations, haranguing them about American foreign policy. Ironically, he started that and said, I will try to be brief. Went on for 4.5 hours. I think it's still the longest speech that any leader of a nation has given at the United Nations. And I don't know if anyone wants to sit through that. And when he arrived, he stayed in Harlem and he visited Malcolm X quite deliberately because he thought that these people were oppressed by the Americans. And, you know, he was making a point. He also wandered around with Nikita Khrushchev in New York. These two wandered around New York with a US police security detail and the press. Amazing images to think that this occurred in 1960. But, you know, relations were much more strained at this point in time. In compensation for seizing American industry, the US decided to seize the planes that Castro and his delegation arrived on at Idlewild Airport. When he returned, he couldn't fly home. So Nikita Khrushchev gave him a Soviet plane to fly home on. And if anything, you know, he was certainly pushed into the arms of the Soviet Union after 1960. It was a very different visit. But the visit that started today in 1959, smash hit, particularly with the ladies. Moving on then, last event from today, April 15th in history, involves Dr. Samuel Johnson. This man here, because today, in 1755, his English dictionary was published. Now, I want to make clear here that this was not the first dictionary, and nor was it the largest. There were about 20 dictionaries that had been published in the 150 years before this, possibly more, and some of them even had more words than he did. So what makes this dictionary so important? Well, it's because Johnson incorporated several innovations. For example, he would not only have the word, but he would have what the word was used for. So whether it was a noun, an adjective, or a verb, etc. He also had listed varieties of meanings. So time, for example, has 20 different definitions in his dictionary. And the word take has, I think, 134 different definitions in his dictionary. And he also had illustrations to try to show what words meant. Little poems. I've got one of those for you later. I'll just have to get it for you to show you what I mean. These are all quite common now, but they were an innovation at the time. Prior to this, dictionaries were rather cumbersome glossaries of words, and they were only hard words, and they only gave single definitions. But Johnson recognized how flexible the English language was and how vast in terms of meaning and intonation it was, and tried to reveal that. But also there is an argument to say that this is not simply a useful tool, that in fact, Dr. Johnson's dictionary should be considered a work of literature. Why? Because he filled it with his own character and his own opinions. He was originally commissioned to write it in 3 years. It took him 8 years. Now, to put that into comparison, the Académie Française, writing the dictionary of the French language, employed 40 scholars and took 40 years to complete their dictionary. Samuel Johnson being a bit late and writing it in 8 is amazing when you consider he did it himself. He did have members working on his team, but only to copy out quotes and illustrations from Shakespeare and Milton to prove the points he was. He would say what they were, he highlighted them in books, and they had to copy them up. How much work did he do on his own in those 8 years? He compiled, defined, and illustrated 43,700 words for his English dictionary. Now, another point of comparison, today, for example, the Oxford English Dictionary has 171,000 plus words in its dictionary. But, I mean, that is a remarkable feat to compile and explain and illustrate 43,000 plus words. Well, how does that compare? That's more words than the average person in Britain uses. Your average vocabulary ranges between 20 to 35,000 words. And if that sounds implausible, you say, well, I don't know 20,000 words. I'm sure that you do. You just don't realize you do. And if you really don't, then you need to worry, because the average vocabulary of a 4-year-old is 5,000 words. Yes, 5,000. Do you know more than 5,000 words? If not, you're probably under 5. So an amazing feat to compile all of these words. And when published today in 1755, it was a massive tome that cost £350 in today's money to buy. Well, who would buy that? It was fascinating, I have to say. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how he put his character in it. And I'm going to have to read some quotes here. Let me give you some impression of it. Here are some definitions of words. And you can tell that this is not a neutral definition. This is his own words. Politician, a man of deep conjecture. I'm sure in the modern world we'd all agree with that. Piss burn. Great word. That's what he was defined as, a urine stain. I'm going to use that now instead of a urine stain. Well, I have no real need to use it. I mean, I don't wet the bed or anything. Honestly, no. I'm not going to use the word. Don't need to. Lunch. This is one of my favorite definitions. Lunch is defined as much food as one's hand can hold. Yes, if ever there was an advantage to having large hands, Dr. Johnson has found it. Lunch. Okay, some of his stuff is a little bit juvenile, though. And if I give you some of these other definitions, it isn't all as glorious as that. There, by the way, is a digital copy of his dictionary. You can go and have a look for yourself at all of these sorts of things. This is the second volume from the letter L onwards, and it's the condensed version, not the large original one. Anyway, some of his more juvenile entries. Bum, a part we sit on. Sock, something put between the shoe and the foot. Well, that's just not really very helpful, is it? Lizard, like a snake with legs added. I mean, that could be written by a 5-year-old. There used to be a program like that. Tell us what this means, and the 5-year-old on TV would say something entertaining. And, you know, they're not all wonderful. Some of the words that he has in there, you know, just I have no understanding of. And even for one word, he says, I don't know the meaning of this, but he put it in there anyway. But there is, for example, the word niderosity, which turns out means a meaty burp. So the dictionary is enormously wide-ranging. He has these damning indictments of things like politicians in his definitions. He has very simplistic ones like bum or sock, and he has wonderful ones like lunch, which tells you a little bit about his character. But there were some things he didn't like, and it is expressed in his dictionary. No French words. Didn't like that at all. So the word finesse is defined or is described as an unnecessary word creeping into the language. The word ruse is described as a French word, neither elegant nor necessary. Great. He also frequently in his dictionary insults the Scots. I'm sorry. Oats, defined as, in England, feed for horses. In Scotland, feed for people. Yeah. It's also full of illustrations, and this is really what sets it aside from all other dictionaries. And it becomes the main basis of dictionaries for the next 150 years until the Oxford English Dictionary is published. I just want to get you, just here, got it, some of the things that he puts in there. There are 114,000 illustrations in his 43,000 words. And if I can just read you one or two, I've got one of them here. The word fart, which is defined as a wind from behind, very polite, but he also illustrates it with a little poem so that you understand it. Love is the fart of every heart. It pains when 'tis kept close, and others doth offend when let loose. Marvellous stuff. I urge you to take a look at the dictionary and have a look at his illustrations. Samuel Johnson published the dictionary today, 1755. That's your lot. That's the 15th of April today in the past. And I will see you all tomorrow for the 16th of April. Have a good day. Enjoy the sun. Get out and put as much food in your hand as you can for lunch. Johnson told us to. Bye-bye.